When I got home yesterday, it was like a ghost town. Like, she wasn't here. Kids weren't here. I have no idea like where they went.
On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, woke to what seemed like an ordinary Monday. Children were preparing to return to school after the weekend. Neighbors left for work. Lawns were being watered. It was the kind of peaceful community where people waved as they drove past each other's homes, and where crime was something that happened somewhere else. But by the end of that day, everything had changed. A pregnant woman was missing. Her 2 young daughters had vanished alongside her. Inside their family home, almost everything appeared untouched. Her shoes were still by the front door. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her medications remained where she had left them. Even her car was still parked neatly inside the garage. It looked as though she had simply disappeared into thin air. Her husband, Chris Watts, told police that after an emotional conversation about their marriage, his wife had taken their daughters and left the house. He claimed he had no idea where they had gone. As friends, neighbors, and investigators searched desperately for the missing family, Chris appeared calm. He pleaded for their safe return in front of television cameras, insisting that he just wanted his family back. But investigators would soon uncover a very different story, one built on lies. A story that would leave millions of people asking the same question. How could someone who appeared to be an ordinary husband and father be responsible for such an unimaginable tragedy? To understand what happened, investigators first had to look beyond the headlines and into the lives of the Watts family before everything unraveled. Chris Watts was often described as quiet, reserved, and easygoing. Friends and coworkers said he rarely raised his voice. He enjoyed working on cars and preferred staying out of the spotlight. People who knew him generally viewed him as dependable, someone who avoided confrontation whenever possible. His wife, Shanann Watts, had a very different personality. She was energetic, outgoing, and highly active on social media. Through live videos and family posts, she shared moments from everyday life, birthday celebrations, family vacations, school milestones, and simple evenings spent together at home. Thousands of people followed her updates, watching what appeared to be the story of a loving family building a happy life together. Together, Chris and Shanann were raising 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, lovingly called Cece by family and friends. In the summer of 2018, Shanann announced that she was pregnant with their 3rd child.
We did it again. I like that shirt. So pink means...
That's just the test.
I know. It just says the pink is going to be girls.
I don't know. Just the test.
That's awesome. Guess when you want to, it happens.
A boy they planned to name Nico. To the outside world, they looked like a family entering an exciting new chapter. Their large home in Frederick reflected that image. Family photographs lined the walls. Children's toys filled the living room. The neighborhood was quiet and welcoming. Everything suggested stability. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, the marriage had been under increasing strain for months. Financial challenges had placed enormous pressure on the household. The family had previously filed for bankruptcy, and although they continued trying to rebuild their finances, the stress remained. Bills accumulated. Credit card debt lingered. Like many families, they faced ordinary struggles that outsiders couldn't easily see. During the summer of 2018, Shanann traveled to North Carolina with Bella and Cece to visit family. Chris remained in Colorado for work and joined them later for part of the trip. According to relatives, those weeks revealed growing tension within the marriage. Conversations became strained. Affection seemed to disappear. Shanann sensed that something had changed, but she couldn't fully explain why. Unknown to her, Chris had recently begun a relationship with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship developed quickly during the weeks Shanann and the children were away. Chris presented himself as someone nearing the end of a marriage, creating an impression that he was close to starting a completely different life. While Shanann was planning for their growing family, Chris was imagining another future altogether. The contrast between those two realities would soon collide. During the weeks leading up to August 13th, Shanann confided in close friends that Chris had become distant. Phone calls felt awkward. Text messages became shorter. She worried that their marriage was in trouble and hoped counseling might help them repair the relationship. Friends encouraged her to remain hopeful. They believed the couple could work through their problems. No one imagined how quickly events were about to unfold. On August 11, 2018, Shanann traveled to Arizona for a business trip related to her work. Friends later remembered that although she enjoyed spending time with colleagues, she also seemed worried about the state of her marriage. Throughout the weekend, she exchanged messages discussing her concerns and her hopes of reconnecting with Chris after returning home. Late on the night of August 12, her flight landed back in Colorado. A close friend, Nicole Atkinson, drove her home from the airport. Security footage later showed Shanann arriving at her house at approximately 1:48 in the morning. She walked inside carrying her suitcase, unaware that it would be the last time anyone outside the home would see her alive. Just a few hours later, before sunrise, Chris backed his work truck into the driveway. A neighbor's security camera captured the unusual activity. Although the camera's angle did not reveal exactly what Chris was doing, investigators later noticed that he spent an extended period moving back and forth between the garage and the truck. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary morning before work. Only later would investigators realize how important those few minutes had become. That same morning, Shanann failed to attend an important doctor's appointment. This immediately raised concerns. Missing an appointment wasn't like her. She also stopped responding to phone calls and text messages from friends. Nicole Atkinson tried repeatedly to reach her. There was no answer. As the hours passed, Nicole became increasingly worried. She knew Shanann well enough to recognize that something was terribly wrong. Finally, she drove to the Watts home herself. Shanann's car was still inside the garage. That made no sense. If Shanann had left voluntarily, why would she leave without her vehicle? Nicole knocked on the front door. No response. She looked through the windows but saw no movement inside. Then she noticed something else. Shanann's shoes were still by the entrance. Those were the shoes she wore almost every day. Friends later explained that Shanann rarely went anywhere without her purse, her phone, or her medications, all of which appeared to still be inside the house. The situation no longer felt unusual. It felt urgent. Nicole contacted Chris, asking where Shanann was. Chris replied that he didn't know. He said they had discussed separating and claimed Shanann had left with the children after their conversation. The explanation didn't satisfy Nicole. It didn't fit the person she knew. Concerned for her friend's safety, she called law enforcement and requested a welfare check. Within hours, officers from the Frederick Police Department arrived at the home. What began as a routine missing person investigation was about to become one of the most closely followed criminal cases in recent American history. Police officers arrived at the Watts home during the afternoon of August 13th. At first, the call appeared to be a routine welfare check. Cases like this often have ordinary explanations. Sometimes a phone is left behind, plans change unexpectedly, or a family member simply forgets to tell someone where they've gone. But almost immediately, officers noticed details that didn't add up. Chris Watts arrived home while officers were speaking with Nicole Atkinson. He unlocked the front door and invited everyone inside. His wife and daughters were nowhere to be found. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. Investigators began walking through each room, looking for anything that might explain where Shanann and the girls had gone. In the kitchen, Shanann's purse sat on the counter, with her wallet still inside. Her phone was discovered in the house. Her medications, which friends said she needed every day, had been left behind. For detectives, these weren't just forgotten belongings. Together, they painted a troubling picture. People who leave voluntarily, especially a pregnant woman planning to care for 2 small children, typically take the essentials they need. Leaving behind nearly everything suggested that whatever had happened was unexpected. Chris repeated the story he had already told Nicole. He said that after discussing their marriage that morning, Shanann had become upset and left with Bella and Celeste. He insisted he didn't know where they had gone and hoped they would return soon. The explanation sounded simple. The evidence inside the home did not. As officers continued searching, they noticed there were no obvious signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared broken. There were no overturned pieces of furniture or shattered windows. But experienced investigators know that the absence of visible disorder doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened. Sometimes the most important clues are the smallest ones. Outside, Officer Nick Baumhover spoke with a neighbor named Nate, whose home security system pointed directly toward the Watts driveway. Nate offered to show the officers footage from that morning. Chris stood nearby as the video began to play. The grainy black and white recording showed Chris backing his work truck into the driveway before sunrise. Normally, according to the neighbor, Chris parked on the street. This morning was different. The truck remained backed into the driveway while Chris walked repeatedly between the garage and the vehicle. The camera angle didn't clearly show what he was carrying. But investigators noticed something else. As the footage played, Chris became noticeably uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, folded his arms, and avoided looking directly at the screen. At one point, Nate quietly commented that Chris wasn't acting like himself. The video alone did not prove a crime had occurred, but it raised important questions. Why had Chris backed the truck into the driveway before dawn? Why had he made so many trips between the garage and the truck? And if Shanann had truly left on her own, why wasn't she visible leaving the house? Those questions would stay with investigators. As the welfare check turned into a missing person investigation, more detectives joined the case. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation and later the Federal Bureau of Investigation also became involved. Search teams canvassed the neighborhood. Volunteers distributed flyers. Friends shared Shanann's photograph across social media, hoping someone had seen her. The case quickly gained national attention. That evening, Chris agreed to speak publicly. Standing outside his home with television cameras pointed toward him, he made an emotional appeal. He said he wanted his wife and daughters home. He asked anyone who knew where they were to contact law enforcement. He described the house as empty without them. The interview lasted only a few minutes, but it spread rapidly across news stations and social media. Millions of people watched. Some viewers believed they were seeing a worried husband desperately searching for his family. Others felt something seemed off. Investigators, however, were not relying on public opinion. They were focused on evidence. And the evidence continued to grow. Detectives began interviewing friends and relatives. Nicole Atkinson explained that Shanann had been excited about her pregnancy, but deeply concerned about problems in her marriage. She described how unusual it was for Shanann to ignore calls or disappear without contacting anyone. Family members echoed those concerns. They said Shanann adored her daughters and would never willingly leave them behind or cut off communication with loved ones. Investigators also examined Chris's recent activities. They learned that he worked for an oil and gas company called Anadarko Petroleum. His position required him to travel to remote well sites across the region. On the morning Shanann disappeared, Chris had visited one of those isolated locations. That detail immediately caught detectives' attention. If something had happened before Chris left for work, investigators needed to know exactly where he had gone and how long he had been there. They requested records from his employer. Vehicle GPS data, electronic work logs, security information. Modern investigations often rely on digital evidence as much as physical evidence, and every electronic record helps build a timeline. Meanwhile, detectives also began examining Chris's phone records. They noticed extensive communication with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. The two had exchanged hundreds of text messages and lengthy phone calls over the previous weeks. When investigators interviewed Nicole, she explained that she believed Chris was in the process of separating from his wife. She said he had described his marriage as nearly over and had presented himself as someone preparing for a new beginning. Her account gave investigators valuable insight into Chris's recent life. It also established a possible motive for deception. As detectives pieced together the timeline, another pattern emerged. Chris appeared surprisingly composed. He answered questions politely. He cooperated with investigators. But several of his statements changed over time. Small inconsistencies began appearing. When exactly had he last seen Shanann? What time had he left for work? Had anyone witnessed Shanann leaving the house? Each answer seemed to create another question. Investigators knew they couldn't draw conclusions based on instinct alone. They needed facts. Those facts were slowly coming together. Search warrants allowed detectives to examine the Watts home more thoroughly. Specialists processed the house, collecting potential evidence, while forensic teams documented every room. Neighbors were interviewed again. Friends provided text messages. Family members shared conversations from the days leading up to Shanann's disappearance. Each piece, by itself, seemed ordinary. Together, they began forming a very different picture from the one Chris had described. The investigation had now entered a critical stage. Detectives no longer viewed the case as a simple missing person investigation. They were beginning to consider the possibility that Shanann and the children had never left the house alive. Still, without direct evidence, they needed Chris to keep talking. Every interview, every statement, every timeline, every digital record, it all had to match. And if it didn't, investigators believed the truth would eventually reveal itself. Within the next 48 hours, detectives would confront Chris with the growing inconsistencies in his story. They would ask him to take a polygraph examination, a test he voluntarily agreed to. It would become one of the most pivotal moments in the entire investigation. Because after days of insisting he knew nothing about his family's disappearance, the carefully constructed version of events he had presented to everyone around him was about to begin falling apart. By August 15th, nearly 2 days had passed since Shanann Watts and her daughters had disappeared. Investigators had spent countless hours reviewing surveillance footage, interviewing witnesses, examining digital records, and comparing every statement Chris Watts had made since the search began. Although they still lacked definitive proof of what had happened, they believed they were getting closer to the truth. The timeline Chris had provided didn't align with the evidence they were collecting. His explanation of the morning's events contained gaps. His movements before work raised questions, and every new piece of information seemed to point investigators back to the same person. Rather than making an arrest without sufficient evidence, detectives chose a different strategy. They invited Chris to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation offices for another interview. He agreed. The meeting began calmly. Investigators asked Chris to describe the events of August 13th once again, moving carefully through each hour. He repeated that Shanann had returned home late from her business trip. He said they had an emotional conversation about their marriage. According to Chris, he then left for work while Shanann remained at the house with Bella and Celeste. He insisted that when he drove away, everyone was alive. Detectives listened carefully. They weren't looking only for major contradictions. Sometimes it's the smallest inconsistencies that reveal the biggest truths. After the interview, investigators asked Chris whether he would voluntarily take a polygraph examination. He agreed without hesitation. Before the examination began, the examiner carefully explained the process and reminded Chris that the test worked best when the person being examined answered honestly. Chris confirmed that he understood. The questions were straightforward. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where your wife is? Do you know where your daughters are? Chris answered no. When the examination concluded, the examiner reviewed the results before returning to speak with him. The message was direct. The examiner said the results indicated deception and that they did not believe Chris had been truthful during the test. Chris appeared shaken. For the first time since the investigation began, his confidence seemed to falter. The interview continued. Investigators encouraged him to tell the truth, explaining that the evidence was steadily revealing what had happened. As the conversation progressed, Chris changed his account. He claimed that after an argument, Shanann had harmed their daughters and that he had reacted by killing her. Investigators did not accept this version of events at face value. They continued comparing his statements with the physical evidence, witness interviews, and forensic findings. As the investigation advanced, that explanation did not match the facts established in the case. Detectives now had another critical lead. Earlier in the investigation, GPS information from Chris's work truck had shown that he had driven to an isolated oil and gas site owned by his employer on the morning of August 13th. The location, known as Survey Ranch, was far from residential neighborhoods. It wasn't a place where people casually stopped. Search teams were dispatched to the site. As investigators examined the area, they made a devastating discovery. The search confirmed that Shanann Watts and her daughters had been taken to the remote location. The findings transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The search teams worked methodically, documenting every piece of evidence. The remote oil site, which had appeared ordinary just days before, had now become one of the most important crime scenes in the country. News of the discoveries spread rapidly. Communities across the United States had followed the search, hoping for a different outcome. Instead, the worst fears had been realized. 3 innocent lives had been lost, along with Shanann's unborn son, Nico. For investigators, the focus shifted from finding the family to ensuring justice for the victims. Forensic specialists spent days processing evidence. Digital experts reconstructed timelines from phones, computers, and electronic records. Medical examiners conducted detailed examinations. Each independent finding strengthened the case. As the evidence accumulated, investigators concluded that Chris Watts alone was responsible for the murders. With the evidence continuing to mount, prosecutors moved quickly. On August 21, 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the deaths and the unlawful handling of the victims' remains. The case that had begun with a simple welfare check had, in just over a week, become one of the most shocking family homicide investigations in modern American history. As court proceedings began, the public searched for answers. How had a man with no known history of violence reached this point? Friends described him as quiet. Co-workers called him dependable. Neighbors said they had never witnessed loud arguments or disturbing behavior. Yet investigators had uncovered evidence of a secret relationship, increasing marital strain, and a growing desire to leave his current life behind. None of those circumstances explained or justified what happened. Millions of families experience financial difficulties. Many marriages struggle. Relationships end every day. But almost all people facing those hardships make lawful choices to move forward. The tragedy in Frederick was the result of decisions made by one individual, and those decisions forever changed the lives of everyone connected to the Watts family. As the criminal case moved toward trial, another painful chapter was beginning for Shanann's parents, her brother, and the countless friends who had spent days believing she and the girls might still be found alive. Instead of preparing for a joyful future with a new baby, they were now preparing to say goodbye. The courtroom would soon become the setting where the facts of the case would be formally acknowledged and where the families of the victims would have the opportunity to speak about the profound loss they had endured. For many people following the case, it was no longer about understanding Chris Watts. It was about remembering Shanann, remembering Bella, remembering Celeste, and remembering the future that little Nico would never have the chance to experience. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors continued reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. Every interview, forensic report, digital record, and witness statement was carefully organized to build a complete picture of what had happened in the Watts home during the early hours of August 13th. The evidence was substantial. Investigators had reconstructed Chris Watts's movements through surveillance footage, GPS data from his work truck, cell phone records, and interviews with co-workers and friends. They had established a timeline that contradicted the story he had told police during the first days of the investigation. With the case growing stronger, prosecutors prepared for what many believed would be a lengthy and highly publicized trial. But a trial never came. In early November 2018, Chris Watts agreed to plead guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder and other related charges. By accepting responsibility, he avoided the possibility of a death sentence, which prosecutors had been considering under Colorado law at the time. For Shanann's family, the decision was incredibly difficult. A public trial might have answered more questions. It might also have forced them to relive every painful detail in a courtroom for weeks or even months. Ultimately, they supported the plea agreement, explaining that they wanted to spare their family from additional trauma. It was a decision made not out of forgiveness, but out of a desire to begin healing. When the sentencing hearing arrived later that month, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Friends, investigators, reporters, and family members gathered to witness the final stage of one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent American history. Chris Watts stood before the court as the charges against him were read. He offered a brief apology, acknowledging the pain his actions had caused. For many observers, the apology felt inadequate compared with the enormity of what had been lost. No statement could undo what had happened. No sentence could restore the lives that had been taken. The most powerful moments came not from the defendant, but from the victim's loved ones. Shanann's family spoke about the daughter they had lost. They remembered her determination, her generosity, and the love she had for Bella and Celeste. They spoke about the excitement she felt while preparing to welcome another child into the family. They described Bella as kind, thoughtful, and protective of her younger sister. Friends remembered her bright smile and gentle personality. Celeste, affectionately known as Cece, was remembered for her energy and playful spirit. She had a contagious laugh that could brighten an entire room. Then there was Nico. He never had the chance to take his first breath. He never celebrated a birthday. His future existed only in the dreams his family had imagined for him. The judge acknowledged the profound loss suffered by everyone who loved Shanann and her children. He described the crimes as incomprehensible and noted the lasting impact they would have on multiple families and an entire community. Chris Watts was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the legal system, the case was over. For the families left behind, the grieving had only begun. In the years that followed, the Watts case remained the subject of documentaries, books, podcasts, and extensive media coverage. People searched for answers. Many wanted to understand how someone with no publicly known history of violent crime could commit such devastating acts. Experts from different fields examined the case through their own perspectives. Some focused on relationship dynamics. Others discussed deception, financial stress, personality traits, or family conflict. While these discussions offered different viewpoints, investigators emphasized an important point. There is no single explanation that can fully account for crimes like these. No financial problem, no marital disagreement, no affair. None of these circumstances excuse or justify murder. Millions of people experience similar challenges without resorting to violence. Responsibility rested solely with the person who made those choices. Another lesson emerged from the investigation. The case demonstrated how modern forensic techniques can piece together a timeline even when there are no eyewitnesses. Security cameras, GPS records, digital communications, cell phone data, electronic transactions. Each source of information provided investigators with another piece of the puzzle. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they revealed a sequence of events that could not be ignored. The investigation also highlighted the importance of people who trusted their instincts. Nicole Atkinson has often been recognized for acting quickly when Shanann stopped responding. She knew her friend's routines. She understood that something wasn't right. Instead of assuming Shanann would eventually call back, she drove to the house, contacted Chris repeatedly, and ultimately requested a welfare check. Those actions brought law enforcement to the Watts home within hours of Shanann's disappearance. Investigators have said that her persistence helped accelerate the investigation during its earliest and most critical stage. It is impossible to know how events might have unfolded had she decided to wait another day. Sometimes, paying attention to unusual behavior and speaking up when something feels wrong can make an important difference. As the years passed, Shanann's family worked to preserve the memories of those they had lost. Friends continued sharing stories about Bella's kindness, about Cece's joyful personality, about Shanann's determination to build a loving home for her children. Their memories became a reminder that this case was never simply about a criminal investigation. It was about 4 lives that were stolen. When people discuss the Watts case today, it is easy for attention to focus on the person who committed the crimes. But the true legacy of this case belongs elsewhere. It belongs to Shanann, who loved her children and looked forward to welcoming a new baby. It belongs to Bella, whose quiet compassion touched everyone around her. It belongs to Cece, whose laughter filled her family's home. And it belongs to Nico, whose story ended before it ever truly began. Their names deserve to be remembered, not because of the tragedy that took their lives, but because they were loved. They mattered, and they continue to matter. Cases like this remind us that appearances can be misleading. The image a family presents to the world does not always reveal the struggles taking place behind closed doors. Yet even in the face of unimaginable loss, there are people whose courage stands out. Friends who refused to ignore warning signs. Investigators who patiently followed every lead. Families who found the strength to speak for those who no longer could. Those are the people whose actions continue to inspire long after the headlines have faded. If this story teaches us anything, it is the importance of compassion, honesty, and paying attention when something feels wrong. Because sometimes one phone call, one concerned friend, or one decision to act can change the course of an investigation forever.